Every neurosurgeon at Seoul National University Hospital had walked away. The Ice King of the global underground, a man who had conquered the triads and the Yakuza before his 40th birthday, was now nothing more than a body in a black hospital gown. Kang Min-sik lay in the center of a high-security suite, surrounded by silent guards and machines that beeped out the rhythmic hollow countdown to his end. 3 weeks ago, 3 bullets had pierced his chest in a back-alley betrayal that shook the city. Now there was no brain activity. His mind was a silent city where the lights had been turned off forever, and his second-in-command had already prepared the DNR papers to clear the bed in 48 hours. The vultures were circling. His rivals were already carving up his shipping lanes, and not a single soul who entered room 902 came out of love, only greed or cold calculation. But every night a cleaning woman named Lena Bryce would push her cart into the room and do something the doctors thought was a waste of time. He talked to him. Not because she knew he was a billionaire syndicate boss, but because she saw a human being behind the heavy black tattoos that covered his arms. Lena was a ghost in Seoul, an Afro-Korean single mother drowning in debt and living in the cracks of the city. She was one missed shift away from the street, carrying the weight of a world that refused to see her. She told this silent stranger about her daughter, Sharon. She spoke of the way Sharon laughed at the rain and how she pointed at the moon through their cracked apartment window. And deep inside the endless void of his coma, the most dangerous man in Asia was holding on to her voice like a lifeline in a storm. Lena's stories were the only sparks of light keeping his soul from drifting into the dark. Then came the night that defied every law of science. When Lena, desperate and with nowhere to go, had to sneak her feverish crying toddler into the ward. In a moment of pure survival, she laid little Sharon on the broad tattooed chest of the man the world had pronounced dead. What happened over the next few hours wasn't medicine. It wasn't logic. And no doctor on earth could explain the reading on the monitors. If this story doesn't move you, nothing will. Hit that like button if you believe some heartbeats are meant to find each other. Share this with someone who needs a miracle and subscribe to see the transformation. Because sometimes the most powerful man in the world isn't the one with the empire. It's the one who becomes a shield for a child. Park Jin-hwan stood in the sterile hospital corridor, his shadow long against the white tile, staring at the dark ink on his own hands. It had been 3 weeks since the hit, and he could still smell the copper of blood and the smoke of the silenced pistols. He remembered the look of surprise on Min-sik's face when he fell, as if the King of Seoul couldn't believe his own blood would turn the pavement black. Jin-hwan had known Min-sik since they were enforcers in the docks of Busan. He remembered the day a young Min-sik watched his own mentor get dragged away by the authorities. Min-sik hadn't flinched then. He hadn't flinched when he climbed the ranks through iron and blood, or when he built a shadow empire that reached across oceans. He had turned himself into a weapon, merciless, brilliant, and cold. But now that weapon was broken. The Ice King was melting away, and the empire he built was cracking with every silent second that passed in room 902. Or so they thought. The wheels of the heavy industrial cart squeaked in a rhythmic, mournful protest against the sterile linoleum of the 9th floor. To the rest of the world, Lena Bryce was a shadow in a blue uniform, a woman whose existence was defined by the dirt she removed and the trash she carried away. But inside room 902 the world changed. The air was colder here, smelling of ozone and expensive antiseptic, and dominated by the mechanical sigh of a ventilator that was the only thing keeping the Ice King from melting into history. Lena moved with a practiced, quiet grace, her dark skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights as she began to wipe down the surfaces of the high-security suite. She didn't look at the armed guards outside the door. They never looked at her anyway. Their eyes were for threats, and Lena, with her tired eyes and the faint scent of baby formula clinging to her skin, was no threat to anyone. She finally approached the bed, her movements slowing. Kang Min-sik looked less like a man and more like a fallen monument. His jawline was sharp enough to cut, his dark hair perfectly groomed even in his stasis, but it was the ink that always drew her in. Intricate, dark dragons and crashing waves spiraled down his muscular arms, disappearing beneath the black hospital gown that made his pale skin look like marble. To the city these were marks of terror. To Lena they were just a map of a life she could never understand. "It rained again today, Min-sik," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the clinical beep of the heart monitor. She didn't call him sir, or boss. In the dark of the night, they were just two souls drifting in the same silent harbor. Sharon thought the thunder was the sky grumbling because it missed its breakfast. "He's getting so smart, you know." She tried to share her crackers with a stray cat this morning. "We don't have much, but she's got a heart big enough to feed the whole of Seoul." As she polished the chrome rail of his bed, Lena's smile faded. The reality of the slums outside the hospital's glass walls began to press in. The landlord came by again. He doesn't care that the heater is broken or that the mold is creeping up the walls. He just wants his one. I'm 3 shifts short this month because Sharon had that cough, and every time I look at the mailbox I feel like I'm suffocating. It's funny, isn't it? You're lying there with all the money in the world and you can't even breathe on your own. I've got all the breath in the world and I can't afford to live. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches above his tattooed forearm before she pulled back. She shouldn't touch him. But she stayed, leaning against the cold metal rail, letting her words fill the empty space. She told him about the one-eyed doll Sharon slept with, about the taste of the cheap ramen she'd had for dinner, and about the invisible thread her mother used to talk about, the one that connects people who have nothing left to lose. In the depths of his gray fog, Minsik didn't move. But for a split second, the jagged line on the monitor seemed to dance with a new, subtle rhythm, as if his heart were reaching out to catch the sound of her voice before it vanished into the night. The heavy double doors of the private wing hissed open, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Park Jin-hwan didn't walk so much as glide, his custom-tailored suit a sharp, obsidian contrast to the sterile white walls. Behind him, the 2 guards straightened their spines, their eyes darting to the floor. Jin-hwan didn't acknowledge them. His gaze was fixed on the glass window of room 902, where the Ice King lay defeated by a heartbeat he could no longer control. He entered the room with a practiced air of solemnity, pulling a heavy chair toward the bedside. To any nurse watching through the station monitors, he looked like a grieving brother in arms, a loyal second-in-command keeping a final vigil. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and let his head hang low. But beneath the facade of mourning, his eyes were wide open, sharp and predatory, tracing the jagged shallow spikes on the heart monitor. He didn't see a friend. He saw an obstacle. You always did have a sense for the dramatic, Minsik, Jin-hwan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that never reached the security microphones. He reached out and adjusted the sleeve of Minsik's black gown, his fingers lingering near the 4 line. But the world has moved on. The docks in Busan are under my seal now. The triads have stopped asking for you. They're asking for me. He pulled back his cuff, the gold of his watch catching the clinical light. 47 hours. In less than 2 days, the lawyers would arrive with the finality of a gavel. The accidental power surge he'd paid for would ensure that even the backup generators stayed silent just long enough. He smiled, a thin, cruel line that never touched his eyes. I brought you flowers, he said louder for the benefit of the hidden cameras, gesturing to a massive arrangement of white lilies that smelled of funerals and endings. The men miss you. They want to know when the king is coming home. He leaned closer, his shadow falling over Minsik's tattooed chest, momentarily eclipsing the ink dragons. But we both know the truth. A king who can't hold a sword isn't a king. He's just a memory. And I've always hated living in the past. Jin-hwan stood up, smoothing his jacket with a sharp, dismissive snap of the fabric. He looked down at the man who had once been his mentor, his brother, his god. He saw the way Minsik's chest rose in that weak, artificial rhythm, and for a fleeting second he felt a prickle of the old fear, the memory of Minsik's ruthlessness. He shoved the feeling down, replaced by the cold heat of ambition. He checked his watch one last time, the ticking second hand sounding like a muffled executioner's drum in the silence of the room. He turned on his heel, leaving the scent of lilies to choke the air, already thinking about the victory banquet he would host the moment the flatline became permanent. He didn't notice the way the light from the hallway caught a single stray tear that had escaped Minsik's closed lid. Not a tear of grief, but a silent, mounting storm of a man trapped in his own body, listening to his world be sold for gold. The Judas kiss had been delivered, but the betrayal was far from over. The cold rain of soul didn't just fall. It seeped into the marrow of the city, turning the neon lights into blurry, weeping stains on the asphalt. For Lena, the world had finally begun to fracture. She sat in the corner of her cramped, drafty apartment, holding Sharon against her chest, feeling the terrifying heat radiating from the toddler's skin. Sharon's breaths were ragged, short bursts of air that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Every few minutes, the child would whimper, a small, broken sound that tore through Lena's heart more effectively than any blade. Lena had called the clinic, but the voice on the other end was as cold as the rain, citing a list of fees she couldn't begin to cover. When she called her manager at the convenience store to ask for a late start so she could find a neighbor to watch the sick child, the response was even swifter. He didn't ask about the fever. He didn't ask about Sharon. He simply told her that if she wasn't behind the counter in 10 minutes, she shouldn't bother coming back at all. The line went dead, and with it the only steady paycheck that kept the moldy ceiling over their heads. By midnight, the fever had spiked to a point that made Lena's vision blur with panic. Sharon's eyes were glassy, her small dark face flushed and damp. Lena had no money for a taxi, no medicine left in the cabinet, and now no second job. Desperation is a quiet, heavy thing. It strips away pride until only survival remains. She wrapped Sharon in 3 layers of blankets, tucked her into a worn carrier, and stepped out into the downpour. The hospital was her only sanctuary, not because she could afford the ER, but because she knew the service entrance. She moved like a ghost through the loading docks, her wet shoes squeaking against the concrete. The hospital basement was a labyrinth of humming pipes and oversized laundry bins, a place where the air was thick with the scent of industrial bleach and steam. She found a corner behind a mountain of linen carts, a hidden pocket of shadows where the security cameras didn't reach. She sat on the cold floor, rocking Sharon, trying to use her own body heat to soothe the child's tremors. But the basement was damp, and the toddler's cries were beginning to draw the attention of the night staff. Lena knew she couldn't stay here. If the supervisor found her, she'd lose her cleaning job, her final lifeline. She looked up at the service elevator, the one that led directly to the 9th floor. To room 902. It was the only place in the city where she was allowed to be in the dark. The only place where a silent giant waited in a state of suspended animation. Up there, the air was warm, the guards were indifferent to the cleaning girl, and the man on the bed didn't ask for rent or receipts. With a trembling hand, Lena pressed the button for the 9th floor, cradling her sobbing daughter against her heart. She was a woman with nowhere left to run, heading toward a man the world had already given up on, praying that the Ice King had enough warmth left in him to hide them both for just one night. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that felt like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence of the 9th floor. Lena stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched the bundle in her arms. Sharon's whimpers were muffled by the damp wool of her blanket, but to Lena, they sounded loud enough to wake the entire hospital. She stepped into the hallway, keeping her head low, her eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of her work shoes. The 2 guards outside room 902 were deep in a hushed conversation about a sports bet, their posture relaxed, their boredom a shield Lena hadn't expected. They barely glanced at the woman in the blue cleaning uniform. To them, she was part of the furniture, an invisible gear in the hospital's machinery. Lena didn't stop to breathe until the heavy door of the suite clicked shut behind her, sealing out the world of debts, firing notices, and cold rain. Inside, the room was bathed in the dim, rhythmic blue glow of the life support monitors. Kong Min-sik lay as he always did, a silent titan of ink and marble. But tonight the air felt different. The countdown Jin Huan had started was humming in the wires, and the stillness of the room felt like a heavy weight. "I'm sorry, Min-sik," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "I have nowhere else. Please, just for tonight, let us stay in your shadow." She sat on the small vinyl chair, but Sharon wouldn't settle. The toddler's fever had made her skin sensitive to the touch, her little body twisting in Lena's arms as a fresh wave of heat made her wail. The sound was sharp, desperate, and dangerous. If the nurses heard a child's cry coming from the VIP wing, Lena would be gone within minutes, and Sharon would be out in the freezing rain. It wasn't a claim of fatherhood, but a vow of protection. The Ice King looked at Lena, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the invisible thread that had pulled him back. A panic flared in Lena's chest. She rocked the child, humming the old lullabies her mother had sung, but Sharon's distress only grew. In a moment of frantic instinct, Lena looked at the broad, steady expanse of Min-sik's chest. The hospital bed was warm, heated by the thermal blankets used to maintain the circulation of a man who couldn't move. With trembling hands, Lena stood and carefully lowered the toddler onto the sleeping king. She tucked Sharon into the curve of Min-sik's shoulder, her small dark head resting directly over the spot where his heart struggled to beat. The silence that followed was instantaneous. Sharon's jagged breathing began to smooth out, the rhythmic hum of the ventilator acting like a mechanical heartbeat that lulled her into a trance. Her tiny, fever-damp hand reached out, her fingers curling instinctively into the black fabric of Min-sik's gown, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her world. As the child's heat began to seep into the man's cold skin, the monitor beside the bed let out a strange, fluttering beep. For the first time in 3 weeks, the flat, gray line of Min-sik's brain activity didn't just crawl. It spiked, a sudden flare of light in the darkness of his mind. The predator and the lamb were now connected by a single pulsing thread of warmth, and in the quiet of room 902, the Ice King began to thaw. In the deep velvet silence of room 902, something impossible began to occur. It started not with a sound but with a rhythm. Sharon's tiny heart, racing with the remnants of her fever, was pressed firmly against Min-sik's broad, unmoving chest. For 3 weeks, the man's pulse had been a slave to the machines, a flat, artificial metronome that spoke of a body without a pilot. But as the warmth of the child seeped through his black hospital gown, the clinical beep of the monitor began to stutter. The two heartbeats, one frantic and one fading, began to search for each other. It was a biological syncopation, a primal call and answer that bypassed every pharmaceutical intervention. Lena watched, her breath hitched in her throat as the jagged green line on the screen began to shift. The rhythm of the child began to pull the man back from the gray shore of the void. Sharon's breathing slowed, her fevered tremors easing as she subconsciously anchored herself to the steady rise and fall of Minsik's chest, and in return, his heart began to beat with a strength it hadn't shown since the night of the betrayal. Then came the surge. Inside the silent city of Minsik's mind, the lights didn't just flicker, they roared to life. In the darkness of his coma, he had been drifting, a ghost watching his own empire burn. But the weight of the child, the soft, trusting pressure of a life that needed him, triggered something more powerful than the will to live. It triggered the instinct to protect. It was the same fire that had once made him the most feared man in Seoul, but now it was stripped of malice. The neurological monitors suddenly erupted in a frantic chorus of alarms. The brain activity sensors, which had shown nothing but a flat wasteland for 21 days, were now reporting a hurricane of electrical signals. The Ice King wasn't just thawing, he was waking up in a state of high alert. To the nurses at the central station, it looked like a catastrophic seizure or a final violent end. To Lena it looked like a miracle. The door to the suite burst open, the light from the hallway cutting through the dim blue sanctuary like a blade. A team of night shift nurses and the resident on call rushed in, their faces tight with the clinical expectation of death. "He's crashing," someone shouted, reaching for the defibrillator cart. But as the lead nurse reached out to pull the crying child away from the patient to begin resuscitation, the air in the room changed. The mechanical sigh of the ventilator was drowned out by a sound that made every person in the room freeze in their tracks. It was a low, guttural groan, a sound of raw human effort. Before the nurse's hand could touch Sharon's blanket, Minsik's tattooed arm, which the doctors had said would never move again, flew up. His hand, large and scarred, clamped around the nurse's wrist with the force of a steel vice. His fingers didn't tremble, they locked. The machines screamed, the lights hummed, and in the center of the chaos, the man the world had declared dead slowly turned his head. His eyes snapped open, not cloudy or vacant, but burning with a terrifying, lucid clarity. He didn't look at the doctors. He didn't look at the monitors. He looked down at the small, dark head resting on his heart, and his grip on the nurse tightened, a silent warning that the king was back and he was no longer alone. The air in room 902 thickened with a tension so heavy it felt as though the oxygen itself had turned to lead. The medical team stood paralyzed, eyes darting from the heart monitor, which was now screaming with a frantic, healthy rhythm, to the man who had been a corpse only minutes before. Minsik's grip on the nurse's wrist didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened, a silent declaration of territory. His breath came in ragged, deep heaves, the first independent air to fill his lungs in 21 days. It tasted of ozone and hospital soap, but to him, it was the sweetest wine. For Minsik, the transition from the void to the light was a violent birth. The gray fog that had consumed him for weeks didn't just lift. It was shattered by the high-pitched, desperate cry of the child still huddled against his collarbone. As his consciousness solidified, the world rushed back in a sensory onslaught. He felt the coldness of the room, the ache in his wasted muscles, and the sharp, localized pain in his chest where the bullets had left their mark. But above all, he felt the warmth. He looked down, his neck muscles groaning with the effort of the movement. There, curled like a small, frightened bird against his ink-covered skin, was Sharon. He didn't know her name, but he knew her heartbeat. He knew the rhythm of her breathing because it had been the only anchor in his dark sea. His other hand, the one not currently holding the nurse at bay, moved with agonizing slowness. It was a tremor-filled, heavy movement, but as his fingers reached the child's back, they didn't strike or push. They curled. He brought her closer, his large palm covering nearly half of her small frame, shielding her from the prying eyes and the bright lights. "Who?" His voice was a ruined rasp, a sound of grinding stones that hadn't been used in a lifetime. His eyes, sharp and predatory even in his weakened state, swept the room until they landed on Lena. She was collapsed against the far wall, her hands over her mouth, tears tracing paths through the dust of the hospital basement that still clung to her cheeks. In an instant, the puzzle pieces of his subconscious snapped into place. He recognized the silhouette. He recognized the scent of her cheap lavender soap and the specific melodic cadence of her voice. She was the one. She was the woman who had talked to him about the moon and the rain. She was the guardian who had sat in the dark and treated a Mafia kingpin like a human being when his own blood was waiting for him to rot. The resident doctor stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Kong, please. You've suffered a traumatic brain injury. We need to examine the child." She's febrile, she needs mine, Minsik interrupted, the word vibrating through his chest and into Sharon's ear. Her fear, her exhaustion, and the way she looked at the child on his chest with a love that surpassed his understanding of power. He realized then that while he had been drifting in the nothingness, this woman had been fighting for him. She had been his only light. With a slow, deliberate motion, he released the nurse's wrist and gestured for Lena to come closer. The world outside was still full of vultures and Judas kisses, but inside this room for the first time in 40 years, Kong Minsik wasn't breathing for an empire. He was breathing for the shadow and the sunlight that had saved his soul. The hospital room had transformed from a tomb into a war room, though the only soldier standing was a man who still required a ventilator to speak more than a few words at a time. Minsik sat propped against the pillows, his face pale but his eyes burning with a cold, focused intelligence that made the remaining medical staff whisper in the corners. Sharon had finally fallen into a deep, healing sleep in a mobile crib tucked tightly against his bedside, her fever broken by the very miracle that had jump-started Minsik's heart. Lena sat at the foot of the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched a lukewarm cup of hospital coffee. The adrenaline of the night had faded, leaving behind the crushing weight of reality. "They'll find me here," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion. "The landlord, the collectors. I lost the store job tonight, Minsik. I don't know where we go when they discharge us." Minsik watched her, his gaze heavy and unblinking. He saw the fraying edges of her sleeves and the deep circles under her eyes, marks of a war she had been fighting alone while he had been drifting in the dark. He reached out with a slow, deliberate movement, his tattooed fingers gesturing toward the encrypted smartphone that had been returned to his bedside table by a terrified hospital administrator. He didn't call his lieutenants. He didn't call the men who had betrayed him. Instead, he dialed a private number that bypassed every switchboard in Seoul. When the voice on the other end answered, a man who handled the syndicate's deepest financial shadows, Minsik didn't waste his breath on pleasantries. "Lena Bryce," he rasped, the effort of the words vibrating through the oxygen mask he now wore. "Search the ledger. Every debt. Every medical bill. Every payday loan attached to her name in this city." He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening as the man on the other end rattled off a list of predatory interest rates and mounting arrears that would have taken Lena 3 lifetimes to pay. Lena watched him, her breath catching as she realized what was happening. "Erase it," Minsik commanded, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying edge of authority. "Not just the principal. I want the records scrubbed. I want the collection agencies to wake up tomorrow and find their databases empty where her name used to be. And the landlord, buy the building. Send him the deed with a note that his services are no longer required." He ended the call and let the phone slip onto the silk sheets. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of Sharon's breathing. "Why?" Lena whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You don't even know me." Minsik turned his head toward her, his dark eyes softening for the briefest of moments. "You spoke to a dead man for 3 weeks, Lena. You gave me the only honest words I've heard in 20 years. He looked at the sleeping toddler, his hand resting protectively on the railing of the crib. "In my world we pay our debts. And I owe you a life." For the first time in years, the invisible thread wasn't just a story Lena's mother had told her. It was a lifeline, pulling her out of the drowning depths of poverty, anchored by the hand of a man who was learning that some empires were built with more than just blood. He was the Ice King no longer. He was a fortress, and for the first time, Lena and Sharon were safe within the walls. The stillness of the 2 a.m. hour was broken by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of men who didn't belong in a place of healing. Park Jinwon's enforcers moved through the VIP corridor like shadows cast by a dying flame, their silenced pistols tucked discreetly beneath dark overcoats. They had been told the Ice King was a ghost, a mere technicality of biology waiting for the clock to run out. Their task was simple: bypass the distracted night guards, pull the remaining lines, and ensure the 48-hour countdown ended tonight. Inside room 902, the only light came from the soft, rhythmic pulse of the monitors. Lena sat in the armchair, her head resting near Sharon's crib, finally claimed by a deep, bone-weary sleep. She didn't hear the soft click of the door lock or the muffled rustle of heavy fabric. But Minsik heard everything. He sat in the darkness, the oxygen mask discarded, his broad back straight against the pillows. His wasted muscles burned with a white-hot agony, but his mind had never been sharper. When the lead assassin stepped into the room, his eyes scanning for the heart monitor's wires, he didn't find a dying man. He found a predator waiting in the tall grass. Minsik didn't call out. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply turned his head toward the intruder, the dim blue light highlighting the sharp edge of his jaw and the terrifying, cold clarity in his dark eyes. The assassin froze, the suppressed pistol halfway raised. It was the look of a man who had walked through the gates of hell and found the door locked from the inside. "You're late," Minsik rasped, the sound like dry earth shifting. The two men behind the leader stumbled to a halt, their bravado evaporating in an instant. They had spent 3 weeks carving up the territory of a corpse, only to find the king sitting on his throne. Minsik's tattooed hand moved not to attack, but to rest protectively on the edge of Sharon's crib, his fingers curling around the railing in a silent promise. "If a single one of you wakes the child," Minsik whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal quiet authority that made the air in the room turn to ice, "I will make sure the doctors have nothing left to sew back together. Tell Jinhuan the debt has changed. I am no longer interested in the syndicate. But if he or any of you step within a mile of this woman or this child again, I will burn the city down just to see the light it reflects in your eyes." The lead enforcer looked at Minsik's hand, the massive, scarred hand that had once broken empires, now shielding a sleeping toddler. The sheer, impossible presence of the man was enough. They hadn't come to fight a living god. They had come to bury a dead one. Without a word, the men backed out of the room, their retreat hurried and silent. Minsik watched them until the door clicked shut, his pulse steady, his gaze unwavering. He looked down at Lena, who stirred in her sleep but didn't wake, and then at Sharon, who let out a tiny, contented sigh. The dragon had woken up, but he wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He was guarding the only two people who had seen the man beneath the ink. The hit was over, and for the first time in his life, Kong Minsik knew exactly what he was willing to die for. 6 months had passed since the night the machines in room 902 had screamed with the impossible news of a dead man's return. The sterile scent of the hospital had been replaced by the warm, lingering aroma of toasted sesame oil and the soft, domestic sounds of a home that felt both new and ancient. In a sun-drenched apartment overlooking the Han River, the Ice King sat on a low silken rug, a far cry from the marble thrones of his past. Minsik watched Lena as she moved through the kitchen, her laughter ringing out as she navigated the organized chaos of a life no longer lived in the shadows of debt. He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had built an empire of fear, and saw how they now trembled not with weakness, but with the weight of a different kind of power. Sharon, now thriving and full of the boundless energy of a toddler who had forgotten the taste of fever, toddled toward him. She stopped just inches away, her wide, chocolate-colored eyes fixed on his forearm. Minsik instinctively started to pull his sleeve down, a reflex born from a lifetime of being told that the ink of the underworld was meant to intimidate and repel. He didn't want his darkness to touch her light. But Sharon reached out, her tiny, soft fingers tracing the head of a dark dragon that coiled around his wrist. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Instead, she let out a delighted giggle, her small hand patting the scarred skin as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Pretty," she whispered, her vocabulary expanding daily in the safety of his presence. Minsik felt a lump form in his throat, a sensation more piercing than any bullet. He slowly knelt to her eye level, his massive frame shrinking to accommodate her world. In that moment, the last of the Ice King truly melted away. He realized that the tattoos didn't frighten her because she didn't see the blood they represented. She saw the man who had held her when the world was cold. He looked up and found Lena watching them from the doorway. Between the three of them, the air seemed to hum with the presence of the invisible thread she had once described, the one that connects souls across the vastest of voids. He had spent 40 years believing he deserved nothing but the crown of a monster, yet here he was, being offered the grace of a father. "I've signed the final papers for the Foundation," Minsik said, his voice now clear and steady. "The syndicate is gone. In its place, we're opening 3 more clinics in the districts where the mothers are still hiding in basements. No one will be turned away for a lack of one. No one will be invisible." Lena stepped forward and sat beside him on the floor, her shoulder brushing against his. They sat in silence, watching Sharon help the dragon fly with her imagination. It wasn't the traditional family the Society of Soul expected, nor was it the ending anyone in the underworld would have predicted. It was a family built from the ruins of a nightmare, held together by a toddler's trust and a man's choice to be better than his history. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the river in shades of gold and violet, Minsik finally understood. The most powerful man in the room wasn't the one who could take a life, but the one who was willing to change his entire world to protect the small hand resting in his. The thread was real, and for the first time in his life, Kong Minsik was finally home.